Today I'm making this from scratch lasagna with homemade noodles, sauce, bechamel, and homemade ricotta cheese. Always wanted to do a project like this, so here I'm giving it a shot. All the measurements will be in the description, and I'll just focus on the techniques during the video. So let's get started. First off, making the ricotta because it needs time to drain. So 2 liters of milk. I'm letting it come up to just below a simmer, about 185 degrees Fahrenheit. Once it hits there, then we're adding a coagulant to it, or an acid. So this is vinegar I'm adding. You could also use lemon juice if you like. And then you keep it at about 185 degrees for 20 minutes. And then you just basically take out the ricotta curds using a slotted spoon. And you want to put that in a colander lined with either cheesecloth or paper towel. And that will sit and drain sort of for the next hour or so. And it'll be ready to go when we assemble. So here I am doing the Bolognese sauce. We've got about a pound of pork belly here that's going into a hot pan and going to render it down, a lot of the fat out of it, and then adding in onions, carrots, and celery. Going to cook that till it gets soft. And we'll see, then we're going to add in about 2 pounds of ground beef here. This is chuck, so it's 80-20. Medium, not lean, because the fat really helps. I'm going to brown it and then adding in a cup of white wine. You could also use red wine and 2 tablespoons of concentrated tomato paste. This is traditional Bolognese, so it really is a meat sauce with some tomato as opposed to a tomato sauce. Here, adding in just a little bit, about 400 grams of tomato, some whole tomato, and a bit of sauce, but not much, not as much as you would see in a typical North American style tomato sauce. Once all that comes together, we're going to thin it out a bit with some chicken stock, adding about a cup of it in here. I made an extra cup just in case I needed to thin it out later. I ended up not using it. Give that a mix, and then the lid goes on, and that is going to simmer on the lowest setting for about an hour. Once the hour has passed, now it's time to add some milk. So I've got a cup of whole milk here, just adding that in, and I'm going to let it simmer for another hour with the lid off. And that will thicken it up a little bit. So now we can turn our attention to seasoning it. So an hour has passed. Give it a taste. I'm adding some salt and pepper. And again, there's no garlic, no other herbs, nothing in here really except for salt and pepper. So give it a taste, make sure it's good. And then we're going to let it cool while we do some of the other things so that it's ready to go to assemble the lasagna. Here I'm making the pasta and I'm using an egg yolk heavy recipe here. So it's just flour, salt, egg yolks with a couple of whole eggs. I'm using a stand mixer, but you can do this by hand if you like. It doesn't take long in the stand mixer, that's for sure. Just do it till it looks like we got the doughs come together and it looks nice and smooth. Take that out and just give it a couple of kneads on the board till we have a nice smooth dough. Now it needs to rest. So gonna flatten it out, cover it in plastic wrap, and it's going to hydrate on the counter for a minimum 30 minutes, but it gives you a chance to do some of the other steps of this recipe. So we're going to move on now to make the bechamel. I'm making a double batch here, twice of what I needed. So that's 8 tablespoons of unsalted butter and 8 tablespoons of flour. This is going to yield a fairly thick bechamel. So once all the flour is in there, you can let that cook for about a minute, and then you start with the milk. So for that amount of flour and butter, I'm using 4 cups of whole milk, adding in a little bit at a time. And it takes its time, but once you get about halfway there, you'll see it'll actually come together in a sauce. And just keep mixing until you've incorporated all the milk. And you want to get it up to a simmer that will thicken it. Here I'm adding a pinch of nutmeg, and I also added some salt and pepper. So you'll see here from the texture, it's got a good thick texture. And this is hot. Once it cools down, it'll almost solidify. So I want it a bit thicker so it stayed in the lasagna. You can make it thinner for other applications. Now the dough has hydrated. I'm just cutting it into 8 pieces, roughly even. I didn't measure it. It doesn't really matter. So just flattening them out, and I'm going to coat them with a little bit of flour so they don't stick together. This dough tends to stick to itself very easily, so you have to be careful with that. And now I'm just going to keep that covered with saran, and it's time now to do the actual pasta. So I've got my machine here. the first one you put through at the thickest setting, and you'll see all these pieces of pasta are sort of different shapes, but you equalize it by giving it a fold. So the two sides fold in together, and then the whole thing folds on itself. And here you can see we've got a nice rectangle that goes back into setting 1, the thickest setting, and then we will run it through successively settings 2 to 8. I did this all the way up to setting 8, which is the thinnest setting on my machine, to get the thinnest pasta possible. You have to keep flouring it as you go, otherwise it might get caught up in the wheels. So once you've gotten to 8, you end up with some pretty long pieces of pasta. And those, I cut them in half and put them on a cookie sheet and separated them with parchment. You don't want them sticking together, which they will do. So here I'm now parboiling the pasta for about 45 to 60 seconds in salted water. That's all you really need, because it will continue to cook in the lasagna itself. So after a minute, just pull it out, and I lay it back out on a cookie sheet here, and I use the same pieces of parchment that I used to separate when it was fresh pasta, uncooked. I use the same thing to separate it so it doesn't stick together now that it's cooked. Time to assemble. So for the first layer, I'm using a glass casserole here. First layer is just a little bit of bechamel and a little bit of sauce, and that keeps the bottom noodles from sticking. And the noodles are all different shapes because, they're homemade, but you just sort of mix and match so you get even coverage for each layer. And I'm sure some folks are probably better at making noodles than me, so they would have even sizes, but I certainly don't. And again, if you're using purchased noodles, this would be a lot easier because they're all uniformly shaped. But you laying down a layer of noodles, then a thin layer of bechamel goes down, spread it around on the noodles, and then about 2 cups of the Bolognese sauce goes down on top of that. And you want to, I'm careful how I spread it. I don't want it to get all mixed up with the bechamel. I want separate layers. So you can see here I am adding the fresh ricotta from the fridge. And I had about 1.5 cups. I probably could have made more and added more, but this seems to be enough. And then finishing it with some freshly grated Parmesan that I did in the food processor, so it was super fine. And now we just repeat everything again. Another layer of noodles that cut to size, and we then layer it again with bechamel, meat sauce, and Parmesan. I managed to get 5 layers into this pan, used up all the meat sauce. So basically just keep going until you've used everything up, and it all kind of equalizes in the end. Last layer is a layer of noodles, then a thick layer of bechamel, and then top it with the Parmesan. And that keeps the bechamel from sticking to the foil as well. That goes into a 400-degree oven and for about 45 minutes, and then pull the foil off and finish it under the broiler. And here you go, the finished product. It is absolutely delicious. You don't have to do every step of this homemade, but any one of these homemade steps will upgrade your lasagna. So I hope you give some of it a try. Thank you very much for watching, and have a nice day.